On October 26, 1881, in the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona, a moment unfolded that would become the most famous gunfight in the American West. But the real story of Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and the shootout near the OK Corral is far more complicated and far more human than the legends that later grew around it. Wyatt Earp was not a sheriff that day, wasn't even wearing a badge. Instead, he was a deputy U.S. Marshal. And his brothers Virgil and Morgan held local law enforcement positions in Tombstone. The Earps were respected by some, hated by others, and constantly walking a thin line in a town bursting with tension. Tombstone was rich, built on silver, and wealth brought corruption, rival gangs, and political rivalries that divided the city in two. On the other side stood the Cowboys, a loose group of ranchers and outlaws led by Ike Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory. The Cowboys believed the Earps supported their political enemies, the business owners and town lawmen. Fights, threats, and confrontations had been building for months. By the morning of the gunfight, the conflict was ready to explode. It began when Ike Clanton arrived in town drunk and furious, claiming the ERPs had been harassing him. All morning, he shouted threats. He was going to kill the ERP brothers and their friend, Doc Holliday. Virgil ERP, the town marshal, eventually cracked down. He pistol-whipped Ike, arrested him for carrying weapons in town, and fined him. But humiliation only made Ike more dangerous. By afternoon, the Cowboys regrouped. Frank McClory, Tom McClory, Ike Clanton, and Billy Clanton were seen armed in an empty lot behind the OK Corral, violating Tombstone's strict no-guns-in-town ordinance. Citizens warned the ERPs that a gunfight was imminent. Virgil knew he had to disarm the men before gunfire broke out in the streets. Wyatt Earp later said, "I was prepared for trouble, and I expected it." Alongside Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday, Wyatt walked down Fremont Street toward the lot. Witnesses said the group looked calm, but their eyes were locked forward. The Cowboys waited, hands near their belts, refusing to surrender their weapons. At around 3 p.m., with only a few yards between the two groups, Virgil Earp raised his hand and said, "Throw up your hands, I. Want your guns?" What happened next lasted only about 30 seconds, but it echoed for generations. A shot rang out. No one is certain who fired first. Chaos erupted instantly. Wyatt Earp fired at Frank McClory. Morgan took a hit across the shoulder. Bullets snapped through the air. Dust rose from the ground. Witnesses later said Doc Holliday's shotgun blast tore into Tom McClory, sending him stumbling. Billy Clanton, though wounded early, kept firing until he collapsed. When the smoke cleared, 3 Cowboys were dead: Tom McClory, Frank McClory, Billy Clanton. The Earps stood battered but alive, except for a minor wound to Virgil and a graze on Morgan. Ike Clanton had fled the moment the shooting began. Despite later stories portraying the shootout as a heroic stand of good versus evil, the truth was messier. Tombstone immediately split in two. Some said the ERPs were brave lawmen defending the peace. Others accused them of murder. Court case followed, filled with accusations, conflicting testimonies, and heated emotions. In the end, the judge ruled that the ERPs and Holliday had acted within the law. They had tried to disarm armed men who resisted arrest. But the violence didn't end there. Months later, the Cowboys retaliated. Virgil Earp was ambushed and maimed. Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards. Wyatt, furious and grieving, led a personal vendetta across Arizona, hunting down those responsible. Over time, newspapers, dime novels, and Hollywood films turned Wyatt Earp into a legend, the calm, fearless sheriff standing tall for justice. But the real Wyatt Earp was more complex, tough, determined, sometimes ruthless, a man shaped by a violent frontier. The gunfight at the OK Corral may have lasted half a minute, but it defined the myth of the Wild West for more than a century. Behind that myth lies the real story, a clash of personalities, politics, pride, and the struggle for control in a booming frontier town. In the end, Wyatt Earp didn't become famous because he survived the gunfight. He became famous because the world never stopped telling the story.